Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. Good golly, Miss Molly, I can't believe it's already turning on late February. Clearly, well into halfway through Q1. But that's not why we're here. We're here for the sixth installment, the sixth lecture of our academic series, MSP Tech Talk. Well received. This is winter quarter. So guess what happens after this webinar, folks? You got to go on winter break, and we'll talk about that. Our guest, the winter break is observed where he's from. It's also observed out here in Seattle, Washington this week, so very good timing. And then we'll be back in several weeks with spring quarter. So, and some interesting topics coming up on that. An MSP who specializes in Bitcoin and some other nefarious topics. But let's stay focused on today. Please use the questions feature to ask your questions of our guests on the Azure and SMB conversation. I will interrupt them periodically to ask on your behalf. There's always never a shortage of questions. I check out the handout section. So we have some handouts over in your control panel for GoToWebinar. You will need to use the computer audio for the videos from our sponsors. And speaking of our sponsors, as you know, our format is to mimic public TV and national public radio, in that we are underwritten by the generosity of some well-behaved community sponsors. And that includes Fortinet, our longtime friend, Synix, our longtime friend, as well as SolarWinds. So we're going to give a shout out to each of those as we go along. It's a chance for you to take a sip of water when we have a Fortinet moment and a Synix moment. Now, with that said, I want to bring in Frank Olhurst. A lot of you know Frank. In fact, Frank, I want you to introduce yourself and how people would have known you over the years from the test labs and beyond, and then we'll jump into it. But Frank, first of all, where are you and what are you wearing?
I'm in New York. I'm in New York, Long Island, actually, in my home office, and I'm wearing a smart pantsuit that will work well on the campaign trail.
There you go, my friend. And I know in our rehearsal, you have winter break, we have winter break, and these listeners are about to go on winter break after winter quarter terminates in about 90 minutes. How about that?
Sounds pretty good. So,
okay, Frank, give us your background and then let's jump into it. But you really do have an interesting background. Most people know who you are. They may not know that, but they do.
Oh, no, I better change my name and hide. So, I mean, let me quote what a famous admiral once said: "Who am I? Why am I here?" And let's delve into a little bit of background here. Yeah, my name's Frank Olhurst, as Harry mentioned. And, you know, I'm a technology junkie with a background in enterprise technology. My education, bachelor's and MBA and all that is technology focused. And yep. I worked for a solution provider for several years, and I ran my own solution provider organization. Then I worked for the federal government for a 3-letter agency for a few years, and then I transitioned over into the world of enterprise consulting and technology journalism. I was over at Computer Reseller News from 99 to 2008, where I was the lab director and tested products thoroughly. Focused a lot on cybersecurity. From there, I went over and I started a publication called Channel Insider under the eWeek brand. Yep. And I was there for a few years. And then Ziff Davis Enterprise was bought out by another company, and I decided to go the freelance consulting route at that point in time. Interestingly enough, I still contribute to leading B2B publications such as CIO, eWeek, Enterprise Networking Planet, Enterprise Security Planet, RT Insights, GigaOM, and a list of a lot of boutique publications. And I focus on SMB enablement as well as enterprise technology, especially emerging technology
Yep.
and infosec. And of course, the cloud, because everything nowadays is the cloud. And that's kind of scary to say in some respects, especially for us old timers.
There you have it. And Frank, you and I reconnect. It had been too long, and we reconnected in October. And folks, really put this on your radar screen, the Spiceworks conference in Austin, Texas. Boy, howdy. That felt a little bit like Comic-Con and a technology conference. That was one fun conference, man, with
Yes,
the
it
costumes.
was.
Well, hey, Frank, let's jump into the good stuff. Thank you for introducing yourself, my friend. Let's rock.
So, I'm here today to talk about Azure. And the reason why I'm talking about Azure is that it's actually become a thing. We've all seen the commercials. We've all seen, Microsoft jumping up and down, yelling cloud and Azure, and, the cloud is the future and things like that. But, from a practical standpoint, especially in the small and medium business arena, what the hell does Azure mean? I mean, other than a pretty shade of blue that clouds populate, what is Azure? So, Azure is Microsoft's take on providing cloud services. And by cloud services, I don't mean the generic, hey, here's my website or here's this particular application or elements like that. I'm talking about the resources that allow you to build your own cloud. And by building your own cloud, I'm talking about technologies such as infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service, all of these nifty things that can come together and create your fully operational cloud that kind of lives out on the Azure hardware, which is scattered about the world and replicated and does all these neat and fun things. But when people hear about cloud technology and they hear about moving things out into the cloud, one of the biggest issues comes up is that, hey, isn't that kind of for big businesses? Isn't that kind of what the General Motors and these folks are looking to do? Isn't this all, kind of about them, spreading their, business capabilities all over the world and all that? And it brings up an interesting conversation, one of which really comes down to, what is a small business? In the olden days, the days of, on-premise equipment and all that, a small business was pretty easy to define. We used to kind of knock around with the ideology that a small business was less than 50 users. But, businesses change. Things change. And, a small business by some is defined by what the revenue is. By others, is defined by what the total headcount is. And so you could take something like a factory where you're counting all the workers, and that's no longer a small business, even though there might only be 5 actual IT consumers in that business. So it gets a little bit murky. So I'm thinking probably a better way to look at, how a small business fits into this ideology is, kind of a business that, is either single site or headquartered and has their IT assets all within that headquarters, only used by a few people on premise. So, that really brings up a big difference. What exactly is on premise and what exactly is the cloud? On premise is, the concept of where you've got all your IT equipment, in-house, in the case of small businesses, usually crammed into a closet somewhere, gathering dust and generating heat, likely to explode at any minute if it's not taken care of. And then we have the concept of the cloud where, who knows where the hardware is. In reality, who even cares as long as it's managed properly? Microsoft, let's take Microsoft, for example, with Azure. They've built these huge data centers the world over that replicate each other. And when you start putting things out in the cloud, your workloads, let's call them that, which could be your business applications or a line of business apps or what you're looking to do with your IT equipment, lives on a piece of virtualized hardware somewhere within one of those data centers and it's replicated. So, it's best to think of a cloud as kind of, your file server that's somewhere else that you don't have to really care about as much. So, that's really kind of the big difference between on-prem. On-prem means all your resources are local. You can kind of walk to them. You could trip over them. You could kick them when they're not working. And the cloud where, it's just out there. But know, in the back of your mind that it does, your workloads do physically live somewhere. It's just that somewhere isn't as critical until you get into, issues of compliance and things like that. Things that many small businesses don't have to worry about, but some do, and we'll touch on that later. So let's talk about how money changes when we start talking about on-premise and the cloud. On-premise is very much about capex, capital expenses. You go out and you buy hardware. You buy this piece of hardware, and then you buy software to run on that piece of hardware. Then you buy the licenses for that software. And that's all an outlay, right up front. Very rarely can you do an on-premise implementation by turning it into, a small monthly payment. And there's a reason for that. Other than leasing or finance.
And hey, Frank.
Yes,
Frank,
sure.
Forgive me. I somehow hijacked presenter mode. Jenny over in the radio control room, can you make Frank the presenter? My bad. I fumble thing. I'm monitoring the question section, Frank, and I fumble fingered, which maybe I should, as they say, read the manual. I'll just leave it at that. There's women and children on this webinar, so I'll just leave the old saying at that. Frank, don't go there. Don't go there, my friend. Frank, I think you're coming back in as the presenter. Sir, if you could show your screen again. There we go. Sorry, folks. Frank,
okay.
I'll go back on mute.
I know, Harry. I just know it's your evil secret plan to undermine me in this.
All right, but no, Frank. I think, with all due respect, I think our audience of MSPs, they got the memo on prem and cloud and that kind of thing. So and sorry to break your cadence. I'll go back on mute.
Right. No, I just want to make sure that the folks listening understand the basic concepts, just so that they are able to explain it to their customers. Because what happens in a lot of times, especially with MSPs, when you walk into a new customer, there's kind of a disconnect between your understanding and ability to explain things and the layperson's understanding. So, I'm applying it from the small business perspective so that this information can be used, as part of a sales tool. And, understanding some of these basic business concepts is very important. So, as I was saying about, the capex versus opex, when it comes to that capex explanation, people are outlaying significant sums of money up front, and some senses that can be a challenge. They get the advantage, though, of write-offs over time. So there is a tax advantage to capex. Operational expense, can be very easily compared to, what your utilities cost you, electric, phone, and things like that. And a lot of business owners readily understand that, saying, okay, we could shift this large upfront cost into something that is a manageable, budgetable monthly item. And that becomes a valid selling point and a valid understanding point for folks. Next, I'm going to hit, what is a hybrid cloud solution? Most of our audience knows what a hybrid cloud is, but they might lack the ability to properly explain what that hybrid cloud is. And when it comes down to it, offering that explanation really comes down to being all about explaining that there's a combination of on-premise technology and cloud technology, where the on-premise technology starts to run that hybrid, where the on-premise technology starts to run cloud technology, so it can work better with an external cloud or public cloud solution.
Well, Frank, I think I can add an interesting tidbit here that I just had a long chat yesterday with SMB Nation member Matt Anderson out of a small town called Wyoming, Michigan. Believe it or not, Frank, Wyoming, Michigan. And he was on the Intel hybrid cloud team. Frank, you may remember, I think it's about 2010 those were dark days in the economy, my friend, and
Yep.
thank God, Intel was innovating. They had a thing called the Intel Hybrid Cloud. Matt was on the team, and we talked about it yesterday. That's the guy that's going to come back spring quarter and talk about Bitcoin mining and cryptocurrency, and he is an MSP now, so it's very interesting. But Frank, it was an interesting walk down memory lane because I don't know if in your reporting you got into the Intel Hybrid Cloud, but what they were trying to do was essentially have a storefront akin to Parallels, the way Parallels enables storefronts to now called Odin, now called Ingram Micro.
Yep.
But basically, double click and an MSI file, for lack of a better word, would install the app and you get billed. And that was their view of the world for hybrid cloud, was a store, a piece of hardware, and the stuff that would be on-prem made sense, and the stuff that would be on the cloud made sense, and it was double-click easy with a credit card to buy the apps. So now you know what I know on hybrid.
Right. Yeah. Hybrid's evolved since then, but yeah, that was the route that they were going.
That's right.
They were looking to make hybrid very, very easy, simple. Plug and play simple, if you will, which was met with some resistance at that point in time, especially from our solution provider friends.
Don't go there. Don't. All right, moving on, my friend.
All right, I'm going to advance to my next slide, and I'm going to take a quick look back on what's changed, what has happened out there. A while back, on-premise solutions made a lot of sense. And for those folks that were, before they were MSPs, were the good old SMB consultants and all that, that kind of meant that, you'd physically go visit your client and you'd, drop a server in or a server appliance, configure the hardware, build a little network, and, say to them, I'll see you next Tuesday. And the idea was that, everything was on-prem. You were a phone call away to maintain it. And you would, work on kind of a time and materials basis. Eventually, that kind of evolved into more complex on-prem solutions, such as things like Microsoft Small Business Server, which, had a bumpy start, but evolved into an excellent piece of technology that wound up being, for lack of a better term, severely crippled when it came to being able to scale beyond a small business. So what we would see is a lot of the solution providers out there with these on-prem solutions like Small Business Server would start leveraging, line of business applications. Okay, hey, it's great you've got, Microsoft Small Business Server, you've got Microsoft Office here, but, you don't have this level of IT in your business just to, write letters and make presentations. There's obviously some type of line of business that you perform. And then, they would install, those vertical market applications or, billing programs or even things like QuickBooks to kind of bring those businesses into the 20th century, if you will, at that point in time. So they built a nice little business around that. It gave those solution providers kind of full control of IT, but also the full burden of support. It also wound up being, somewhat cost sensitive to the end customer because, there were always surprises when you were dealing with internalized IT. And many of those surprises were, created by user error or things like that, which brought the burden of support back to that, solution provider. So, that's where we were. And it wasn't that long ago. So, on-prem started falling out of favor. We started running into the issues of, the cost started increasing. We had, hardware, software, and licensing costs steadily increasing. Businesses started becoming aware, especially because of events, in the news, whether it was hurricanes, earthquakes, or things like that. They started becoming more concerned with business continuity and disaster recovery But, oddly enough, many of the small businesses out there weren't willing to pay for those type of things. They needed them, but they didn't want to pay for them. That created another conundrum. Then we also had the specter of patching, upgrades, and maintenance. It was always something. Every Tuesday was Patch Tuesday. Everything started becoming more complex to orchestrate, which meant buying more management modules or spending more time on site or remote controlling it. And then there was always the regular maintenance schedule, keeping things clean, making sure things are working. And it started becoming more and more time consuming for that solution provider to do all these things, and more expensive for the end customer, who really didn't appreciate the value of those things. They only tended to appreciate the value when things stopped working and you fixed them. So preventative maintenance was always kind of looked down upon in some respect. Then we ran into the issue of where support started coming from all different areas. You were running these systems that were somewhat homogenized, and in some cases, required all sorts of interaction with the different vendors. And we started seeing, all right, we've got a problem with the server. Is it hardware related? Is it software related? Is it application related? Then that turned into the finger pointing and leaving that, solution provider kind of holding that bag, like, oh no, how do I fix this problem? The customer doesn't want to hear about my agita. They just want the thing fixed. Then, of course, we started running into security concerns with, viruses, spyware, malware, all of that type of stuff. And then, of course, you had the businesses that, were growing, and they wanted to work out of multiple sites. And, technologies like Small Business Server just didn't do that very well. Then you came into issues of scale. If businesses were growing and IT was working great, and it's like, okay, we need to add another 10 seats, and they were at the 50 seats already, it would mean rethinking everything, either new licenses or new deployment, changing hardware, and scalability became rather complex. Add into that the rise of the smartphone and mobility, and on-premise became one of those things that you just didn't want to be involved with anymore. Businesses, still wanted to wrap their arms around it because it was tangible, but from the support point of view, it wasn't such a great thing to be involved with anymore. And, trying to eke a living out with doing it became harder and harder. So, the cloud.
Well, that's what Mama Bear found with us MSP. Hey, Frank, stay on your new slide, but I did want to crack a little bit of a joke. Since you're from New York, you're going to be able to answer the question for me. When you said it's always something, I'm going to say that was the line of what Rosanna Dana from Saturday Night Live wasn't it Rosanna that said that line?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Enter the cloud. Let's do it.
Yep, entering the cloud. All those problems led to other opportunities being created, and a lot of smart vendors out there recognized it. Now, you had things like line of business applications transitioning to the cloud. And the main reason why is that you look at these software vendors and they're like, all right, I could sell an upgrade every year, or I could get a monthly subscription for my software. Which made more sense for them? Of course, that monthly subscription. So, you had things like Salesforce and, countless other things come out that were really software as a service solutions, which moved up into the cloud, which meant, the on-prem commitment became having a working browser at that point in time. That helped a lot of these small businesses to begin embracing the web. Not only that, it also fueled a trend where, there was a shift in support. Now, your small business clients out there or operators were like, okay, if they had a problem with Salesforce, they were calling Salesforce. They had an SLA with them. They had a contract with them. You weren't in the picture anymore as a service provider. And then the customer came to have to, rely on this behemoth for their support. And it would be support for just that one line of business application. In the beginning, it worked out very well. You make the phone call, someone would answer and answer your problem. As these things grew, it became harder and harder to get a hold of a person, and you were put into the world of bots to try and get answers to your questions. Other things that happened that made the cloud more viable was, companies embracing virtualization, and as of late, containerization. Virtualization, where you could take that one piece of hardware and make it act as many, and you can isolate all the loads on it from each other so that you could have, one server out in the cloud supporting 5 different businesses as long as it had the horsepower. And, the client didn't know at the end point that was really what was going on, nor did they care as long as their stuff worked and it was cheaper. It also brought up the issue of, shifting over from that capex moving to that opex model. So, here it is that, all right, I need to buy a CRM solution. I could spend, $1,500 on, when something like Goldmine when it existed, or I could spend, $19 a seat per month on Salesforce. And that's how that transitioned. It became very, very appealing to the budget conscious people because, again, it seemed like that they were only buying what they needed to use, just like electricity. They weren't paying for anything extra. And that led to, more and more businesses getting involved in this whole cloud enablement market where, you started seeing all sorts of services out there, platforms as a service, infrastructure as a service, disaster recovery as a service, storage as a service, software as a service. And this whole as a service alphabet soup continues on as people, think of new ways of leveraging the cloud. What's more, that kind of that shift to the cloud shifted the liabilities and responsibilities off premise. In other words, small business operators, kind of had the ability to point the finger at their cloud services provider when there was a problem. And finally, there was that whole issue of ease of scale. On-prem solution, you've got 10 seats, you got to move up to 25 seats. What's it going to take to do it? It might take hardware, it might take licensing, it might take software, so on and so forth. In the cloud, with the cloud application, it's usually just a quick credit card transaction and boom, you're done. And that is what, gave the appeal of the cloud. So, that leads us to Azure. What is Azure? It's Microsoft's interpretation of cloud services. How does Azure differ? Well, there's a lot of cloud services out there, but Azure tries to bring all the various components together into something that an MSP can orchestrate to resell to their customers. Many people are under the understanding that Azure is for, large enterprises, the big folks out there, but that's not actually true. It's much easier to scale down to meet the needs of a small business than it is to scale up to meet the needs of a large business. So although Azure has all the support in there to handle, implementations of tens of thousands of users and multiple sites and all that, the core basic principles and the foundations are there to support small businesses. Microsoft recognized this, but Microsoft also, from their point of view, is like, all right, we want to focus on those enterprise customers and do the SLAs with them and earn the bucks directly with them. But we don't want to, get involved in, the mom and pop stuff directly. So they co-opted the SMB support community. In other words, they created kind of channel programs for solution providers that wanted to make the transition into becoming an MSP. And they came up with the Cloud Solution Provider Program, which it brings that whole idea of cloud management to, these would-be MSPs. Under Azure, that CSP program offers, things such as, help with sales, help with value-added services, tools for provisioning, gives the MSP full management of all their customer subscriptions. Billing is still done through the partner. Microsoft bills you, the MSP, and allows you to downstream your billing to your customers. And it provides all the frontline support needs for the MSP, which allows the MSP to work as the contact, the primary point of contact for their customer, meaning that they can keep that relationship with their customer even though they're running their customers' workloads on the Azure cloud. And this is a very important distinction between what Microsoft is doing and what some of the other folks out there are doing. You've got the name Microsoft behind it, which can be a good thing. and you've also kind of got that, name recognition, this large company, but you've also got that personal relationship with your customers. Other cloud services providers either try to interject themselves into the conversation or try to take over the relationship. And while that might benefit that cloud service provider, it doesn't benefit anyone else in the group. So that's what Azure is. With that, I'm going to turn this back over to Harry, because he has a happy little video to show you, and he also has a little bit of additional information from one of our sponsors. So, Harry, take it away.
There we go. So we're going to go ahead and have a Cynics moment. And first of all, a couple of observations. Terry, we're jumping into the good stuff on Azure. Terry was kind of wondering if the talk is framed up of cloud versus on-prem. Terry, totally a line from Cynics. Colby.
Hello. This is not Colby. This is Brent. I'm filling in for Colby, though. This is Brent from the Cynics Microsoft team.
Now, shame on you. You logged on with a false identity. There's some security story here somewhere. Let's make sure you don't get served with an indictment, my friend. They're going around this week, so but we won't touch that. Would you? Can we have a conversation about Azure in Cynics? Is that in your wheelhouse? Okay.
It is, definitely.
So what's your story on Azure? Let's play what's your story. I'm going to ask you a couple questions along the way.
Okay. Around Azure, we have 3 sales engineers and growing, and we have 4 solutions engineers, technical folks. These guys are doing webinars weekly that I encourage you to join if you're new to Azure. So we go through the pricing calculator, because that's really where you're going to get your expertise and learn how to price this stuff out, is through Microsoft's pricing calculator. So we do a weekly webinar showing how to use that. If you prefer one-on-one time, we can schedule that as well. But we certainly have the resources to get you and your staff trained up through these webinars and through one-on-one time as individual deals approach. And then our story around pricing is through the CSP channel. It is 12% off of the MSRP. So if you get good at using that Azure calculator, you can take a 12% discount off of that. Once you figure out the estimated cost on the calculator, you can assume that your consumption discount will be 12%. We bill it in arrears. Microsoft's billing date is 17th to the 17th of the month. So billing cycle that we're in now, it would be February 17th to March 16th. And then that would invoice out beginning of April. So we're billed in arrears about a month and a half back. So something to keep in mind there, but it's all consumption based and you get a 12% discount.
Boy, that'll pay for the monthly beer and peanut commitment at your golf club. So that's okay. We're starting to. Hey, look at it this way: it's twice the commission of a residential realtor, right? They're working for 6%. So let me get a little bit of chippy, but I want to make a point. So first of all, and it relates to the role of a distributor, and you hit on a couple of key points I'm going to circle back to, but I want to preface it just being a little bit chippy that, first of all, you're not going to be able to buy Azure on Amazon.com, folks. And the reason I say that with a little bit tongue-in-cheek is distributors are rightfully redefining their business models, right? I mean, I can't tell you in the real world how many conversations I have a year where someone's like, oh, the laptop was only $499 on Amazon and it was $498 at my distributors. That kind of talk. But what I'm hearing you say about the Cynics Azure play is that you're providing the training. I like the part where you said there's some one-on-one conversations that can be had. You're not going to that to my eyes, that's the value that a distributor adds, right? Does that make sense?
I agree. So what people are looking for in a distributor is someone to help them along the process, which we certainly will do. We can help you pre-sales, figure out how to configure everything. Obviously lower pricing than MSRP. That's something you'd want from a distributor. And then, so just the pricing and support along the way. We'll give you the time of day. We'll take one-on-one time, whatever you need. We're here. We're in this together. More sales for you is more sales for us. So we think of each other as partners.
Yeah, and I just had an incident. We use several email engines. This is unrelated, but this is going to get back to the point of service, is that just had an incident earlier this week with one of our email engines. We use a couple different engines to do what we do. And there was no frickin' live support. It was like fill out the form. And man, I am still waiting for an answer. And back to your point about a distributor is kind of your guide by the side, right? And that to me is the value add. And then maybe one last thing before we go, but could you just restate what the duration, I'm going to call it duration arbitrage, was on billing? You said, help me understand that. I think you said something like a month and a half in arrears. I didn't follow you, to be quite honest.
Yep. So Microsoft does their billing period from the 17th of a given month to the 16th of the next month. That's their 30-day cycle. So, and then we delay invoicing until the beginning of the month after that. So the period that we're in now would be February 17th, just started. That billing period will end March 16th, 30 days. And then we would actually invoice that out not until April, to the beginning of April. So for Office 365 and for CSP, we delay invoicing until the first of the month. So, yeah.
Sure. So there's a little bit of arbitrage there. All right, my friend. Well, thanks for the chit chat. Stay on and please feel free to participate if your time allows. You're welcome to ask questions or add value. We found that to be exciting. Jenny, do you want to pop up a poll? And the question is, do you currently have a Microsoft Cloud practice? Folks, while you're answering that, again, a little bit of housekeeping. We are with Frank Olhurst, who I would offer many of us know from the old CRN test labs. And Frank and I have known each other quite a while, and we've reconnected in modern times because of SMB and Azure. And we're essentially solving Frank, I don't know if I call it we're solving the problem, but we're defining the paradigm, right? This is new stuff, my friend.
Well, it's a paradigm shift. It definitely is. I mean, and it's a paradigm shift that requires people to kind of move out of their what was once their comfort zone and has kind of turned into kind of their I don't want to call it their downfall, but I mean the old model of supporting on-prem equipment and providing those hands-on services at the client's location have fallen on the wayside. And so it's a question: do you want to stay in the the buggy whip manufacturing business, or do you want to become a car dealer?
Yep. And hey, Frank, you're live again. And before, go ahead and advance to your next slide, but I'm going to read Jerry's comment. It's not really a question. Jerry says, let me see if I can make this out. As a service does not shift an MSP's responsibility to the cloud provider, MSPs still have responsibility. On-site or cloud doesn't change responsibility, but cloud complicates life dramatically. Fair enough, Jerry. And then Dwayne Miller. Dwayne, could you retype your question, my friend? I'm seeing an LOL in there about real estate. If you could rephrase that, and I'll recite that to the audience. Frank, you're live. Let's jump into that.
Sure. Well, let's take one point on that question about the shift of responsibility.
Yeah, from Jerry. Yep.
Yeah. When you become an MSP and you're dealing with a single provisioner, it does make your life somewhat simple because you're dealing with just from your point of view, when it comes to support for what you need, you're dealing with one organization. When you're an MSP and you run your own data center, and you have your own physical hardware that you have to manage, and your customer has a problem, you have to go back and figure out, what is causing that problem. That problem might be related to hardware. It might be related to a particular piece of software. It might be related to something somewhere in the stack. It might be related to a router. It might be related to any one of these elements that make up your own, whether it's a colo or your own data center. And solving those problems can become more complex because you need to have on your staff experts in all of those areas to address those issues. And then you're also dealing with SLAs from all these different vendors. So on the back end, support can be much more complicated if you're not using a cloud services provider to back you up. Now that said, there are other avenues to look at when it comes to SLAs and elements like that. And there are other support mechanisms. There's companies out there like Arch Technologies that will take on all of those support SLAs as opposed to you having to deal with each vendor individually. So there are options, but when it comes down to it, if you have, a problem with something you've built in the Azure cloud, or your customer is having a problem with something, your, first line of contact is to deal with, Microsoft and Azure. You never have to worry about dealing with, who the hardware vendors are behind the scenes or anything else. You're dealing directly with your single point of contact, and you're able to escalate your issues. So it can bring more simplicity to the management end of things. As for complexity, when you're dealing with when you're running your cloud services on a platform as a service, using a platform as a service provider, they can help ease the complexity because you no longer have to do as much when it comes to enterprise architecture to build up your services that you're reselling. So, it comes at a little bit of a price. I mean, you're paying for that, but on the flip side, you're getting quicker problem resolution, and you're also getting, the ability to concentrate on innovation instead of integration, shall I say. And, I know a lot of MSPs out there that are in the business of providing managed services to their customers that run their own data centers. And they continuously evaluate, what the costs are involved in running their own data center as opposed to, becoming an Azure reseller, if you will. And as of late, the comparisons have gotten very, very close. And those that I've spoken to that said if they were going to do it all over again, they would not build their own data center or do a colo agreement or something like that. They would just move into a cloud services platform. So that's where we're starting to see that shift.
Well, Frank, I'm not going to let that slip by. If I answered the question the other day, if I could do it all over again, and you know what I would be? A little humor approaching, but I'm telling you, I would be a medical doctor in the sleep area. 70% of people have sleep disorders. I went to the sleep clinic myself, and I'm like, this is a cash cow. So, Frank, you asked the question. I answered it. Please continue.
Yep. I just have to add to that. My good friend, Frank Marshall, who you've met, Harry, him and I always joke if we could do it all over again, we would own a hot dog truck and call it Frank and Frank's Franks.
There you go. All right. Let's move on. Let's get to the good stuff.
All right. Let's talk about the opportunities that, a platform as a service, infrastructure of a service type of offering offers. Azure brings forth new opportunities. What are those new opportunities? It's the ideology of being able to help your customers accomplish digital transformation. And digital transformation means kind of modernizing their operations and bringing those into the cloud, where you take these legacy applications, legacy services, you improve upon them, rethink them, and move them into the cloud, which brings, all sorts of opportunities and benefits to the customer and you as the service provider. Azure can be used to replace Small Business Server. Small Business Server, as you know, end of life, support discontinued basically. Microsoft's answer was like, we're not doing this anymore. If you need these type of things, you can buy all the regular components or, look elsewhere. Azure brings support in for different cloud services. I mean, not only can you build that, that cloud implementation, that cloud-powered environment for your customers there, you can integrate with other services, which become more add-ons that you can sell, or you can get back into the good old world of custom programming or website design or things like that. All these things build additional opportunities while removing the burdens of trying to keep that on-prem stuff alive or having to worry about upgrading that on-prem stuff to bring new services forth. As I just went over in my long-winded answer to Jerry, Azure can reduce support burdens. One of the biggest things Azure can do is it brings that element of scale in, and that's scale up and scale down. You have businesses out there that are impacted by regional and seasonal changes. They might need to scale up for the summer months. They might need to scale down for the summer months. They might need to scale up for the winter, so on and so forth. You can start doing that. And Azure provides that path for, solution providers to become MSPs with, the CSP channel programs and the support that's out there, free resources. It helps them, the solution provider, to rethink their business model to move into something that is more future-proof, if you will. Azure also, eliminates the worries of maintaining those data centers or co-location operations. Many MSPs have, do co-location, or they've built their own data centers, or they've grown their own data centers, and they've done it over the last few years. And they get to a point in time where they have to ask themselves, all right, do I invest more money in, this hunk of real estate and energy and cooling costs and physical location and personnel and all that to grow something that might not meet my needs a year from now, or do I look to do something else? And Azure can very much be that something else. And, that's one way to definitely look at it. So what you have to do is you have to kind of look at this at one step at a time. The tools are out there, the technology is out there, the expertise is something that has to be obtained, and also the education point of view for the customer has to be done. One of the best arguments for moving over to Azure for the end customer is talking about digital transformation. It's time to embrace moving into the cloud because of all the benefits that you get to it and the reduction in capex. And the MSP, the solution provider that's doing that transformation into an MSP becomes that that trusted voice to make that happen. Becomes that critical partner that brings these possibilities to the customer. And with that in mind, the key here is that the MSP has to be educated on what the possibilities are. And of course, there's plenty of resources to do that. Also, using the concept of a hybrid cloud is one way to move fully over into the cloud. You can start using technologies to introduce cloud-like services on-prem to show how the dynamic changes, how web apps can impact the operations and things like that. And then you have that capability to say, okay, we've done this on-prem. We could easily get rid of the on-prem equipment and move this workload over into the cloud. So hybrid becomes an excellent stepping stone, a functional proof of concept, if you will, that can show the end client the immediate benefits and advantages without having them to make a major commitment to doing anything as to fully moving everything into the cloud right away. It also allows the MSP, the solution provider who used to make their bread and butter on, margins on hardware, margins on software, and it was always kind of these one-stop buy a server, I make X number of dollars, and then that's it. Moves them away from that type of ideology more into, a services model where you're billing for services and not, physical pieces of equipment. And that service billing is recurring. And also, it allows you to bring, those software as a solution services to your customer. Now, let's say you're a solution provider and you create your own vertical market applications. And currently you've been selling those to your customers and, doing, the regular things such as maintenance and yearly upgrades and things like that. Now might be the time for you to consider doing your own Azure instance and turning your offering into a software as a service offering, and bringing with it your customers completely into a cloud-enabled environment. So it allows you to transition your business from that point of view. Now, one of these things that we can argue back and forth about is the whole concept of security. And I will argue that, things that are placed in the cloud tend to be more secure than things that are left on site. And I'll tell you why. It's because there's best practices that are involved. And when things are done properly, things are instituted such as multi-factor authentication, better real-time antivirus filtering, real-time malware detection, and all of these technologies and elements become something that is a true reality for anyone that has a cloud instance, as long as they're integrated properly. The on-premise solutions, on the other hand, rely on signature updates and people doing the right thing. There's more of kind of a nanny state to make sure that security is enforced. So, that's my argument for why security for a managed cloud service tends to be better than something that's done on-prem that's connected to the internet. Also, with the Azure, you can start introducing multi-site and mobility. The idea here is that, folks, for the most part, if they have an operational browser and, an appropriate VPN setup and elements like that, they can work from anywhere, which means that if a business wants to set up multiple offices with just a couple of people into it, it's easier to support that with a cloud service. Same with mobility elements as well. So by moving into this world of Azure, you're able to look forward. And it's kind of the idea that you need to present to your customers, because Azure has a lot to offer. With that in mind, we should really look at what the
Well, and Frank, if you don't mind, I stay on this slide. That's fine. What we're seeing out here, and I've got a super good friend who spent a year at a consulting firm. I don't know if they call themselves an MSP. They were DevOps on the left hand, creating Azure snap-ins, and you're kind of getting the add-ons. You're kind of getting to some of this, but on the right hand, they had a thriving practice in the private sector with Azure migrations, lift and shift, and so on. And Frank, I'll give you a quick visualization. Is over here in Seattle by the Space Needle and Lower Queen Anne, we have one of the large cruise ship companies has their world headquarters here because of the Alaska cruise market. And that, they take up 5 floors, right? They have their own building, 5 floors. And that is their client for a lift and shift, right? To take stuff on-prem and move it up to Azure. And that's a good line of work. And you know what it feels like, Frank, when I observe this and have these chit-chats with my friend, is that this feels like 365 a few years ago, where we were doing the Bit Titan thing, the Skykick thing, right? Yeah. I mean, it tends to be early stage in the life cycle, but it's a very real thing. And any comments? I know we're a tad tight on time, folks. We're probably going to run over. It's 1:00. Stick with us. But lift and shift migrations, Frank, feel free to weave it into your list here.
Oh yeah, well, no, that's that is a very valid business model. And lift and shift doesn't just have to go to Azure. I mean, There are folks out there that are doing lift and shift over to, the AWS and over to rack space and things like that. So there's a lot of
Yep.
different players in there. What the question comes down to is it a lift and shift and leave it alone, or is it a lift and shift and do you continue to do the support? Now you talk about something like one of these major cruise lines who has their own internal IT. The question becomes, all right, you're going to do a lift and shift, and then you're going to train their internal IT and what they need to do to be able to operate under those circumstances. Are you done at that point in time? Are you still a trusted advisor, and so on and so forth? Where in the small business world, if you do a lift and shift, you're still going to remain that trusted advisor, and you're probably going to be managing those services for the customer. And I think that's where the big difference comes in, is that Microsoft with Azure is providing all of the support for someone to become an MSP. So they can do that lift and shift operation and then retain that client relationship. And Microsoft bills the MSP, who then bills their customer. So the relationship remains with the MSP. It doesn't transition over to Microsoft. And I think that's an important distinction to look at.
Yes, sir. All right, please continue.
All right. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Azure from, a conceptual standpoint. With Azure, you get improved continuity. And by that, what I mean is for instances of business continuity, you've got your operations are moved out into the cloud. It's up to them to keep everything running. They do replication. They do all sorts of different things to keep things up and running, to give you that at least those 5 nines of reliability. In most cases, you have integrated backup, and there's add-ons you can add to manage those backups and do archiving and things like that. There's also the issue that we've brought up of ease of scale. Scale as you need, scale up or down. It becomes a matter of doing an electronic transaction to make it happen. Lowered capital expenses. That's a great one to go to a potential customer with, to say that, well, it's going to be this much a month, as opposed to, all right, I need 17,000 now, then this much a month moving forward. It brings into existence that utility model, the utility computing model, where it's billed out like a utility. People pay for what they need, what they've provisioned, what they're going to use. It frees up the MSPs to innovate a little bit more, because they're not worried about the day-to-day operations as much when they have their own data center or their own hardware that they're running a cloud service on. Plenty of third-party add-ons out there that are growing. They can fully customize the customer's cloud. And then there's the ease of management. You've kind of got that unified management system, that single pane of glass that you can manage each customer's cloud with, which makes things a lot easier when it comes to problem resolution and really getting a better feeling for what's going on. So let's talk about the cons of Azure. You've got security concerns out there. Every day out in the news, you hear about some major business or some major breach or some major happening out there that brings to light concerns about security. End users, end customers aren't savvy enough to understand what those security concerns actually are, or what actually caused those breaches, or how they even relate to their own businesses. So you have those concerns that you have to kind of address, if you will, for your customers. Whether or not they're valid concerns is a whole different conversation. But the point is that they are still concerns. You have to worry about rising costs. And by rising costs, I mean that, of course, you have, SLAs, agreements, and you have set prices and all that. But, when you're renegotiating contracts, prices could go up, or the cost of add-ons could go up. which feeds right into licensing. If the licensing model were to change, it could become either, even more confusing, or the licensing costs could grow up. You don't really have much control over these things. But it's safe to say that, out in the on-prem physical world, rising costs and licensing costs were a concern as well. You've got the growth of opex. Operational expenses can increase. The question is, do they increase to the point where you're not getting the return on investment that you might have gotten with capex expense? And that becomes kind of an accounting, exercise at that point in time. But it's still something to be very aware of. You also have to worry about vendor lock-in. All right, you've got everything running up on Azure cloud, and let's say Amazon comes out with a better service for MSPs. What's it going to take to move over to that? How locked in are you to that Azure infrastructure? In some cases, if you've abstracted everything and highly virtualized and containerized, it might be easy to move to another provider. In other cases, if you're using add-ons or using direct access of things, you really might run into a problem moving. You have compatibility concerns, and by that I mean Azure has their specific requirements and rules on, maybe how you spin up a server. Let's say it's a Linux server or something like that in a virtual environment. There might be issues with compatibility that you might run into. You have the concept of complexity. Although the cloud on the surface might look less complex than physical hardware, that lack of tangible contact brings a different level of complexity to the situation. You have to better visualize how things work. And in some respects, that's good for the MSP, because it means that the end customer just doesn't want to take on that burden. But on the flip side, it means that your staff has to be properly educated, and things have to be properly documented, and you have to deal with it. There's also
Frank, what I might add there is, we're talking to an audience that never met a problem they didn't like to solve, as you well know, right? You're a geek, you're talking to geeks, they love the work. So complexities, at the end of the day, it's actually a good word.
Right.
And hey, Frank, I want to do one, if you don't mind, a little bit of housekeeping up front. Folks will probably, Frank has about 4 more slides, plenty of time for questions. So David Anderson and Gareth McQuid, I'm going to get to your comments in a moment. I did miss my cue at the top of the hour, 1 p.m. Pacific, that we are also underwritten by the generosity of SolarWinds. And for attending today, we're going to actually sign everybody up, Frank, for a free trial of Mail Assure. So we'll have some comments in the thank you letter about that. But a gift from SolarWinds, and we appreciate their support. Frank, I think you're now at cost of performance and educational challenges. Let's do it.
Right, which ties into complexity. And I just want to mention one thing about complexity. As you said, we're dealing with a bunch of geeks and a bunch of hands-on people and all that. But the fact of the matter is that MSPs themselves often have a lot of turnover when it comes to who their first level support folks are. People move on. Complexity can be, a real issue when it comes to, hiring and training new staff. Just something to keep in the back of your mind. And that's where the educational challenges come in. And then finally, I want to mention about the cost of performance issue. There are situations where you might need more bandwidth. There are situations where you might need more, CPU cycles. You have to look at that and see what that cost of performance is. You also have to look at issues such as, latency and elements like that for, critical real-time applications. So you have to, think about these things and how they can be a negative and how you can turn that negative into a positive under an Azure implementation. So how do you decide to move people over into Azure? Well, how do you decide to convince them? How do you decide if it's even a good idea to do it? When you look at things out there, you have to look at your customers' on-premise challenges and what pain points have to be addressed. I mean, there's simple things when it comes to infrastructure. Is that, customer in a flood zone? Are they in a crime-ridden part of town? Are they susceptible to thunderstorms? Do they have unreliable power? Do they have inadvertent, service shutdowns? Do they have high real estate costs? Are the utility costs high? Is their on-prem equipment not properly secured? Is there a lot of turnover? So, these are some of the on-premise things to look into to figure out if it's a good idea to, move them into the cloud. All of these can be looked at as negatives to be able to say to people, let's move you into the cloud. Another thing to look at is, the age of their infrastructure. The service life of the things are, things like, extended warranties cost a lot of money. There's a lot of complexity with on-prem equipment. There's incompatibility issues as you upgrade things. You have to, continually upgrade antivirus, malware, ransomware, patching, and do all these types of things. Performance and reliability of your hardware becomes, more of an issue as the hardware ages. So, if the client's infrastructure is near the end of its life, its service life, now's the time to have that conversation about moving into the cloud. Another thing you want to look at is, multiple site remote worker needs. More and more companies are starting to address the idea of having off-premise employees or opening up branch offices. Something that might be very difficult to do when you're limited by on-premise equipment. You also might have businesses that are looking to increase their working day or work across time zones or work internationally. Again, the cloud might become a better solution for them at that point in time. You also have to look at what the economic opportunity is for that customer. When it comes down to it, all businesses nowadays are very budget conscious. Now, if you can talk to them about being able to reduce their capex and shift it over to opex, that might free up capital money for that business to work on other things or to grow in different ways. Also, you can, kind of eliminate that risk of over provisioning where, where a customer overpays for stuff that they wind up never using. They also might reduce their real estate costs. They might be, in a situation where business is variable and, reducing capex helps them out a great deal. Also, the cloud helps them to address short-term growth and long-term growth because they're able to scale. Are those clients in a regulated industry, where there's compliance needs? Sometimes it's much easier to implement compliance via the cloud than it is to do it on-prem equipment. There's many factors that can impact, a business's economic growth. And by giving them the opportunity to pursue that growth by reducing their, capex, you might become a very good advocate for that business and a trusted partner. Growth and scale, we kind of covered. Line of business applications. There are so many applications out there that are vertical market applications that are moving to cloud instances. They're moving away from that on-prem ideology. Now, the question becomes, does that end customer, do they need to pay for all that on-prem infrastructure if they're running their line of business applications out in the cloud? Probably not. The whole idea is they could move out into the cloud at that point in time. And of course, there's the whole issue of security and compliance.
Yep. Hey, Frank, let me catch up on a couple of comments. These are more comments I just want to read into the record, if you will, and then I'll get to Peter Jacobson as a question. I'm going to hold off on that. So David Anderson, formerly of Mercer Island, I believe now down in San Diego, says Azure replaces SBS. It seems that Office 365 replaces SBS with the exception of on-prem AD. Azure adds complexity and cost. The benefit Benefits depend on client needs. Frank, let's just take that as sort of a comment. I kind of want to watch our time because we're going to flow a little bit over. Another, Gareth, this is framed as a question. We'll take it, Gareth. McQuid asked, AD on-prem connected to Azure /Workstation on Win 10 to Azure AD, or router to Azure and AD and Azure. Basically, he's asking about the role of AD in Azure with endpoints and nodes. Frank, any comments?
Two comments. The first one on the first, comment was that, as he himself said, it depends upon client need. Office 365 does a lot, but small business server was geared to do even more than what Office 365 is, and that's why I'm looking at it as Azure as the logical movement for small business server.
Fair enough. And there are talks in Redmond about that. So
yes,
they're not public talks yet. Hey, Frank,
on the AD question, I just want to say that, you can fully provision and run Active Directory up in Azure, and depending upon how you integrate your endpoints, you can have, the full wealth and breadth of support. On the flip side, you could even do, virtual PCs up on Azure and really scale down what your local PC has to do at that point in time. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
One last comment, and we'll jump into the partner angle, and then Frank, I think you have some resources coming up, folks. We'll hit your questions as well. But one last comment, Mia Kate Kennedy, the first out of Spokane, Washington, who I actually met at a SolarWinds conference in late October in Orlando, and SolarWinds is, of course, a generous sponsor. She basically just says, is geek really even a current title? Mia Kate, I think we're an industry of too many titles. So now, Frank, there you go. Frank, let's jump into the partner angle.
Sure. Let's talk about this from a partner point of view. Let's say you're a solution provider and you want to become an MSP, or you're an MSP. Where it helps with partner enablement is that, Azure and other cloud platforms are not plug and play. It needs an expert touch. That means you don't have to worry about your customers, your end customers, your small business customers saying, you know what, I'm just going to do Azure by myself. They'll quickly find out, like those that went out and bought small business server themselves, that I need help. So it requires that professional touch. Also, Azure shifts those burdens that, that end customer might have over to paid professionals. The MSP, solution provider, whatever you want to call them today, back in the old days, we called them VARs, are the paid professionals that take on those burdens and, earn money from it. Azure brings, scale, mobility, and innovation into the picture, things that were difficult to sell in the past because they were always based upon dire need, not so much long-term planning. Now with Azure being as you can introduce these elements to your customers, you can basically go to them, not that, hey, your server's burning down right now, we got to, add drive space and do this and do that, so you can keep running. You can actually say to them, hey, if you need to grow your business, we can very easily do that, and we can plan for that based upon what your projections are. Azure supports all sorts of add-ons, complementary services, and customization, allowing you to build a nice little MSP with custom offerings out of an Azure implementation. Azure also brings you that path to those line of business applications. There's integrations such as like with Salesforce and InPartner, and the list goes on of how you can bring these cloud-enabled applications into an Azure cloud and still have the ability to manage them. And of course, Azure has built into a lot of the compliance requirements and security requirements that can help MSPs or solution providers out there that are trying to help their customers meet, whether it's HIPAA compliance or PCI or SOX or, whatever new acronym comes up out there. There are components out there to make it easier to do that. So, there's a lot of resources out there for Azure. Now, I'm going to, give a plug to two friends of mine, people that both Harry and I have met at SolarWinds conferences, as a matter of fact. That's CBT Nuggets and IT Pro TV. They're online educational resources that both offer Azure-specific courses that are meant to help people get their certifications. I want to throw out something out there about an interesting vendor that's done a transition on their business. Kemp Technologies, which used to make physical application load balancers that you would put into your data center, has created a virtual load balancer which runs on the Azure cloud, allowing you to prioritize applications in your cloud environment. It's pretty neat technology, and it comes down to if you have a very large multi-site accessing Azure implementation with multiple clouds talking to each other, you as the MSP can leverage this to improve performance without forcing customers to over-provision. Azure has a marketplace with numerous add-ons. Azure also, via Microsoft, offers a full CSP partner program, and Azure offers integration with Office 365 in the sense that it becomes very easy to combine Office 365 with an Azure cloud, so that if you have customers that are using Office 365 and they want to move upstream to do more, they can. It doesn't become a rip and replace. Yep. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Harry for him to do his Fortinet spiel. And
okie dokie. All right, and folks, thanks for hanging in there. We do have time for your questions. Okay, and I'll read what Peter shared. Haven't heard back from Peter. Oh, we have a poll up. Jenny, thank you. While we're doing that. So Peter Jacobson is a Fortinet partner, and he says we are a dedicated Fortinet partner. Did I see Fortinet is a partner with Synnex Azure? If so, what is the Fortinet relationship? And I can't answer that. So that's, boy, that goes back over the last year, Peter. Thank you for asking that question. I should have, I want to emphasize it, that yes, Synnex is a distributor for Fortinet. Fortinet sells through the channel. So this is hand in glove. There's no question about it, and that's why it's been a good partnership ever since last spring semester. Last year, we were on the semester system like the University of California is, and we converted to the quarterly system like the state colleges in California are. So a little bit of academic ism there, but yes, you could talk to your Synnex representative and so on. So Peter, appreciate you. I see you're listening. Appreciate the question. Thank you very much. Jenny, go ahead and close out the poll. I appreciate it, and then we'll get back to the desktop on Frank's machine. A couple of questions have rolled in, Frank. Some comments. One is from a prior one from Peter Jacobson, and he says, I would be interested in receiving any sample economic justification of on-prem versus cloud for SMB. Frank, I think what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, my friend, if you want to make a note of the name Peter Jacobson, we're going to get you the attendee list for being our guest, Frank, in order for you to, of course, responsibly have interaction with the attendees and answer their questions. And so maybe you could take that offline. And I also think, Frank, your resource slide would also be a place to start for the economic justification of Azure. But Frank, I've done all the talking. What say you on resources for economic justification?
Well, interestingly enough, they can be found all over the place. I mean, as some of my journalistic coverage, I've written many stories on the cost of cloud versus cost of on-prem, and they're scattered about on the various publications I write for. So there's also white papers. I've done some of them, but most of the cloud services vendors, and of course they're going to be a little bit more slanted towards what the cloud services vendors are doing. Of course, they're trying to sell their services, but they do have worksheets up on their sites and elements like that to help you look at those cost justifications. But probably the best way to go about it is to sit down and put together a spreadsheet of what your customers' expenses are from, kind of do it as a free assessment for your customer, and do, what their costs are, what their burden costs are for their internalized IT, and then, shop around and look at what the costs are to do the same things in the cloud. This way you're doing more of a customized analysis. And it also opens up that conversation with a potentially new customer where you could say to them, look, I'll do an assessment to let you know what way you should move ahead. And
Frank, what I've just done is we had Craig Franklin pitch in with an article at itpromentor.com. Folks, I put it up in the chat window to the entire audience. So thank you, Craig, for doing that. Gareth says, I have seen several opportunities for Azure, but all seem to be RDS related. I'm a longtime SBSer, so do I put mail in 365 with EMS, AD, SQL, and file share in Azure? Would welcome recommendations on where to start. So that's actually a good question about remote desktop services, and where would you place the application functionality, Frank?
Well, from my perspective, I would place that up in Azure. And the reason being is, the ability to scale and get the compute cycles that you need for remote desktop. There are folks out there that are actually running, full Microsoft stacks in Azure. They're running Windows Server, they're running Exchange, they're running things like that as a cloud-enabled service under Azure, as opposed to even using Office 365. So it really comes down to a matter of choice of what you're looking to accomplish at the end customer's site. I mean, if you're talking the small business site, you might be able to get by with just doing everything with Office 365 and then just doing file share through, OneDrive or something along those lines. On the other end, if you need to, want to run SQL Server and run some line of business applications and do elements like that, you're going to want to move into Azure for that. So it really comes down to a case-by-case basis of applying the best practices. And that's one of the problems with making something like Azure and Office 365 so flexible. You really have to do the due diligence to find out, all right, well, I know I can do this on either, but which is going to be the better fit for what I need to do? And you need to look at it not only what you need for today, but what you also need for next year and beyond. So, it gets back to what they taught us in college, Harry, in our computer science stuff, doing, the 3-year plan, system design, life cycle stuff, and all that, and then what they taught us in our MBA classes. So it's that due diligence.
There we go. Gareth has another question. Gareth, you are on fire, my friend. Then I'll get to Peter Jacobson had another comment as well. So Gareth now says, and Gareth, no apology needed for asking so many questions. He does say, final one, sorry for making the most of this session and your expertise. Well, Gareth, we do view MSP Tech Talk as free consulting because you're giving us your time and we are providing answers to your questions. He goes on to say, we bill, for example, 150 pounds a month, and for a server. Do we reduce the amount to support in the Azure equivalent? I'm after more of a general opinion rather than actually what we should charge. So, Frank, I frame it up as I'm going to say, Luddites, right? And not that Gareth is a Luddite, but we have a shift in the supply curve with the change in technology. Can you still bill the 150 quid a month to maintain an Azure server as you would a on-prem server? I personally, we're professionals, and I would say go for it. I have worked for free for too many years of my life, and I am now of the opinion that yes, you bill, because it's the relationship, it's the expertise. Frank, what say you?
It all comes down to the value of what you're providing. I mean, the customer that he's charging is paying $150 a month. Basically, when it comes down to it, it's kind of like insurance, just that their stuff is going to be taken care of, that they don't need to worry about it. What difference does it make if that server's in the cloud or on premise? When it comes down to the customer's concern, it should make no difference whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I think when it comes down to it, you could probably charge more for supporting it in the cloud, because you can say to the customer, you're saving money in electricity, real estate space, not having to worry about hardware upgrades, not having to worry about, the cleaning maintenance, and none of that type of stuff, because it's all been moved into the cloud. So they're saving money by moving into the cloud, which allows, you to charge a higher maintenance fee, and then include more in that maintenance fee, like, active monitoring of their, Azure, the spun up server in Azure, or automatic alerting, or things like this that just kind of come free with Azure, become, services that are resellable when it really comes down to it. So, I mean, I'm not one to, to question someone's relationship with their customer, because, that's their relationship and what they've worked out and what they've, accomplished. So, they have to look at it from that point of view. And, if there's a way to go to your customer and say that, we can move you into the cloud and eliminate all these worries, but it's going to be this much a month, I think the customer might go for it, in the fact that what you're doing is you're providing them with better continuity, better security, and lowering their level of worry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair statement. Folks, last call for questions. We're 6 minutes over, which, Frank, that's a good thing in our line of work, to go to overtime. As Bill Maher on HBO likes to say, folks are going to overtime. We have actually gone to overtime. So with that said, I think the deck is clear. So let me just do a wrap here, folks. First of all, shout out to our community sponsors with Synnex, Fortinet, and SolarWinds. You will be receiving a trial version of SolarWinds Mail Assure today for part of your gift, if you will, your gratuity. Frank, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you back, and I'm glad that, is it safe to say that this is one of your beats, right? And the water reporting, we would call, you're on the local crime beat. Azure's one of your beats. What other areas, what other 2 or 3 areas do you cover, so people who want to link up with you and can track your work? What are you covering this year?
I'm doing a lot on cloud enablement and digital transformation, and I'm also doing a great deal on when it comes to cybersecurity and compliance. I mean, that's where I'm focusing a lot of my efforts. But I have the cloud beat over at Penton, so I'm covering a lot of technology when it comes to channel partners and channel futures, those publications. And I'm also doing some, product review type coverage over at Channel Pro. So,
Okay, cool.
Might be, it's one of those, master of none, jack of everything, type of things.
Well, don't be so hard on yourself. You're a well-known quantity in this community. And Frank, last question, then we're going to let everybody get back to work. And that is, are you speaking? Give me a conference that somebody might bump into you at as a speaker or an analyst if you've got one on the books for this year.
I'm going to be over at Channel Futures in Las Vegas early next month. Oh God. Okay. So I'm going to be there definitely. I've got a few others coming up, but off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you the dates.
Sure. And folks, link up with Frank over on LinkedIn. Stay in touch, Frank. Thank you so much. Peter Jacobson says we'll go out with Peter's comment. Thank you for the helpful seminar. Thank you, Peter. Jenny, thanks for your help in the control room. Folks, have a great day and enjoy winter break, and we'll see you back winter quarter. How about that? Thank you very much.